My family wants to give my house to my brother after kicking me out because there was supposedly no space for me, but I'm not doing it for Dan. I want to warn everyone right away that this is going to be very long, so long that I'll be splitting it into 2 posts and including a summary for each one. I honestly don't care who believes this. It's so absurd that I don't blame anyone for thinking it's fake. I won't argue about it, but this really did happen to me. I also don't care if anyone in my family sees this. I won't sugarcoat anything, but I also won't share details that would involve people who don't know me. For context, I'm a single man in my 30s. I have a brother who's 29 and already has 4 children. He had his first kid at 22, the second a year later, the third 2 years after that, and the fourth was born just a few months ago. His wife, my sister-in-law, and I don't get along at all. She constantly tries to get under my skin by acting superior, and the moment I defend myself in any way, she turns into a dramatic, full-blown victim. She can cry on command and put on an incredibly convincing performance to gain sympathy from almost anyone. My parents and my brother absolutely adore her. They know exactly what she's really like, and they simply don't care. I'll admit she's very attractive, but her personality is so awful that I could never feel any attraction toward her. She also refuses to get any kind of job despite having a college degree, and my mother voluntarily helps take care of the kids all day, which means their finances depend entirely on my brother. Because of that, they can't afford to live anywhere except my parents' house. Privacy is a constant issue, with everyone crammed into a 3-bedroom house that was built in the 1960s. Growing up, my younger brother was clearly the favorite. We're only 3 years apart, but he developed a superiority complex because I was punished harshly anytime I retaliated against his pranks. Even back then, it was obvious my parents cared far more about him. He got the biggest share of everything unless other people pointed it out, which happened fairly often thanks to extended family. Eventually, my parents packed us all up and moved about 150 kilometers away from most relatives, so we usually only saw them during holidays since it was a 3-hour drive. As we got older, my brother became physically abusive toward me on several occasions. He relentlessly flirted with my first girlfriend until she eventually broke up with me, and he laughed at every bit of misfortune I went through. Whenever I got upset, my parents told me to just endure it. The only time I ever received equal treatment was when they wanted to keep up appearances. I'll admit there was something darkly amusing about watching their faces when they were forced to treat me the same as my brother on birthdays and Christmas because other people were present. We had very nosy relatives who thrived on gossip and drama, so my parents worked hard to hide what was really happening and threatened to take away all my belongings if I spoke up. That's why they practically celebrated when I turned 18 and left home. It meant they no longer had to provide for me. I hadn't even finished high school when I left, but sleeping on couches was still better than living with them. I've had very little contact since then. They didn't even show up to my high school graduation, and honestly, I didn't care. From that point on, I only saw my parents and my brother on holidays, like everyone else in the family. When the pandemic started, things fell apart quickly. I lost my job and couldn't renew the lease on my condo because my roommate also lost his job, and neither of us could afford the place on unemployment. It was a rented 2-bedroom condo that I genuinely loved. As the lease came to an end, my roommate moved out early to stay with family, and I was forced to sell almost everything I owned because I was about to become homeless if I didn't drastically downsize. I shouldn't have rented such an expensive place, but I liked living a comfortable, almost luxurious life until life stopped being kind. That's when I realized I should have been living somewhere cheaper and saving money as a safety net. Still, I had a plan. I owned a pickup truck because I've always loved trucks, so I found a camper for about $1,000 in good condition and mounted it onto the truck to live in temporarily. It was only supposed to be short-term, but I ended up living in it far longer than I expected. My original plan was to stay in the camper at my parents' house, where my brother and his family still lived. When I asked, they told me the house was full and they didn't want me there. They also said we hadn't gotten along in years. The only way they'd allow me to park my camper there was if I paid them roughly what it would cost to rent an apartment in the area. That was completely unreasonable, especially since I was unemployed and trying to save what little unemployment money I had. For the amount they wanted, I could have rented my own place. They called my camper an eyesore and told me to leave. My sister-in-law found the situation hilarious. My brother joined in, pointing at me and mocking me, calling me a homeless bum. With nowhere else to go, I parked my truck and camper in a store parking lot that first night. I was terrified someone might try to break in, and I barely slept. Other relatives with houses lived far away, and all my friends were in apartments. I was also emotionally attached to the area and didn't want to just leave. I had my mail forwarded to a friend's apartment because it was the only way I could receive it. Finding a stable place to park was incredibly difficult. I spent months living a nomadic life in my camper while searching for a job similar to the one I'd had before. During that time, I dealt with everything from panhandlers and drug addicts to strangers demanding that I move because my camper was ugly. At one point, someone claimed to be part of a homeowners association and ordered me to leave, even though I wasn't parked on a residential street. When I asked which association they represented, they became aggressive and threatened me. I moved anyway to avoid trouble. To keep a steady supply of electricity, I learned to use a long extension cord and plug into any exterior outlet I could find to recharge the camper's batteries. I know it wasn't right, but I needed power to keep my refrigerator running. I had a small solar battery pack for my phone, but no generator, and generators are loud and require fuel. I did what I had to do. After months of living like that, I finally found a new job. I had to move to a neighboring city to avoid going back into retail. I worked retail in college and swore I'd never do it again, even though I came close to breaking that promise. I was still receiving unemployment benefits, but I didn't have a stable place to live while collecting them, and I didn't want to stay unemployed once they ran out. On top of that, I was incredibly bored. Most days, all I did was read, watch movies on a small portable DVD player, use my phone or laptop, and keep track of where I could park and which public bathrooms were available. I even found myself envying how Japan has public restrooms everywhere. We could really use something like that here. When I finally started the new job, I essentially lived behind the building in old employee parking spots near the warehouse that no one else used because they were so far out of the way. My boss, who owned the company, actually liked the arrangement. I was always available to pick up shifts as long as I'd slept a little. He even let me remove the camper from my truck and leave it in one of the spaces so I could drive without it. I'm not sure if that was legal, but no one ever bothered us. During that time, I dealt with very few intruders, and security chased off the ones that did show up. I was basically on call most of the time and worked nearly every day of the week. My boss allowed me to plug the camper into the building for electricity and water, and I paid a small amount of rent by working for free on Sundays when no one else was around except the janitor and the security guard. For showers, I used a friend's apartment or my local gym, since the camper didn't have one. It only had a portable toilet, and I avoided using it because emptying it was absolutely disgusting. So I used other bathrooms whenever I could. I had a key to the warehouse and could go inside to use the restroom at any time. I even got to know the night security guard by name, and since then he's become one of my closest friends. The camper was easy to heat in the winter with a small electric heater, but summer was miserable. There was no air conditioning, so I had to buy a used portable AC unit just to make it bearable. I earned a lot of extra money and picked up new skills from other employees, and eventually, around the middle of this year, I was promoted to a better position at the company as a supervisor. I started earning a higher salary than I ever had before. That was when I decided I wanted a house. The shock of losing my condo made me realize I needed something far more stable in the long term. I started looking near my job, and just 2 miles away I found a 3-bedroom manufactured home on a small lot. I managed to buy it for $110,000 under the asking price. I used almost all of my savings for the down payment and was approved for a mortgage. Finally, I no longer had to live in a camper. There was enough space to back my truck behind the house, remove the camper, and set it up in the backyard, so I placed it there like its own little building in case I ever needed to use it again. Once I was fully settled in, I was stupid enough to brag about it on Facebook. My family saw the post, and that's where this really begins. A few weeks later, my parents and my brother, along with his family, showed up completely unannounced to tour my house. I never gave them my address, so I have no idea how they found out where I live. None of my friends admitted to telling them, and no other family members had visited before that, so I honestly wonder if they followed me home from work or something. It wouldn't surprise me. The moment I opened the door, they all pushed past me like loud tourists and started wandering around as if it were their own house. Everyone kept snooping, and my sister-in-law had this creepy smile on her face. I didn't find out why until later, and when I did, it made me angrier than a steroid-pumped bull that had just been stung by a wasp. My parents wouldn't stop talking about how much extra space I had and how it was far too much for someone like me who doesn't have a wife or kids. Sure, not right now, but maybe someday. My brother kept commenting on how there was more space than in our parents' house and how my place was also much closer to his job. Every red flag imaginable was going off. Eventually, my brother asked to speak with me privately. Everyone else suddenly left the room and crowded onto the front porch. That was when I finally realized they were planning something. My brother, let's call him Dan to keep things simple, said the house was too big for me alone and that I should let him move in with his family because his wife was pregnant with their fourth child and my house was much closer to his work. He pointed out that I still had the camper, so I could live in that outside while they lived in the main house. I want to be very clear here, Dan never once mentioned paying rent, even though he has a good job. He started talking about how there would be changes, even curfews, and that I wouldn't be allowed to come and go whenever I wanted without notice. If he weren't my brother, I would have thought the person in front of me had completely lost his mind. But Dan lost his mind a long time ago thanks to our parents treating him like the center of the universe. I tried to speak, but he kept talking as if I had no say in the matter. There was no chance I was renting my house, or any part of it, to him. Maybe I would have rented to other people to help pay the mortgage, but certainly not to him or his unpleasant wife. I'd heard stories like this before and always thought they were absurd, never imagining I'd actually live through one. But my parents, my brother, and my sister-in-law fit the profile of a group of narcissistic, entitled lunatics perfectly. So I pulled out my phone and started recording. I just held it there. Dan didn't seem to care or even notice. He sat there waving his arms around while listing all the reasons he needed my house. Then he shifted from that to acting like it was already a done deal and tried to reach out to shake my hand. That was when I finally stood my ground and said no, loudly enough that Dan actually took a step back. I had rarely raised my voice like that before, because our parents punished me every time I did. But this was my house, not theirs. I stood up and told him my house was not for sale, and acting like I'd let him move in just because they wanted it wouldn't make it reality. I bought my house for myself. It wasn't my fault he kept having more kids and still had to live with our parents because he couldn't afford to move out. Dan stepped as close to me as he could without touching me and said I didn't deserve the house, that his family needed it more. I laughed in his face and told him I absolutely deserved it because I worked hard to buy it. Of course I deserved it. Dan started yelling that I don't have a wife or kids and don't need all that space, so I should give it to him. I told him I wasn't giving him anything. He hadn't even offered to pay rent, which meant I'd still be paying the full mortgage while not even being able to live in my own home. Then Dan said he shouldn't have to pay rent because family comes first, and that our parents had already decided I was going to do this and that I would comply. I yelled back that their word wasn't law and that they had no right or authority to give him my house. Right on cue, as if it were planned, my parents and my sister-in-law came back through the front door and surrounded me, trying to force me to agree. There was a lot of arguing, but to sum it up, I heard the phrase, "Just do it for Dan," more times than I can count. I told all of them they had no say in my life or my home and that they needed to leave before I called the police. My sister-in-law screamed louder than everyone else that she was pregnant again and that I couldn't do this to her. I told her I hadn't done anything to her. She had simply assumed she could take my house. I had no obligation to her or her family. I called her arrogant and told her she had never shown me any respect, so I didn't care what she thought or how many kids she had. I had no sympathy for her, and she was not living in my house. That set her off. She punched me hard in the face and tried to hit me again, but my brother held her back while she kicked and screamed, demanding to be let go so she could hit me. My phone recorded almost everything. I held it up and said I would call the police if they didn't leave immediately. My parents told Dan it was time to go. As they were leaving, my mother told me I had a week to think it over. I told her I wouldn't, and not to come back. I then told my sister-in-law that my phone recorded everything and that if she tried anything else, I would press assault charges. She screamed at me and ran out crying loudly, covering her face. My mother was the last one out the door and told me again that I should do this for Dan. I replied that I would not. Update 1. As I said in the first half of my post, many people will find this unbelievable. Yes, I'm aware there are similar stories online, and I've seen quite a few of them now. But it's not like those posters have a monopoly on situations like this. If anything, I'm surprised this site isn't used more to expose people like this, because entitled people should be more afraid of having their behavior brought to light. I don't blame anyone for calling this fake. I would probably do the same if I were reading it. However, if you read my first post, you'll understand just how toxic my parents have been throughout my life. They are the root of all of this. They spoiled my brother and turned him into the person he is today, and they never gave me a real reason for it. Some people can't explain why they make decisions like blatant favoritism, so all they can do is continue backing the child they chose. That's exactly what my parents tried to do here. After kicking my parents, brother, and sister-in-law out for trying to force me to hand over my new house, I immediately went on social media and told the story to the rest of the family. It spread pretty quickly, but you won't find it. Now, this part is here because everything was deleted some time ago and I set my own profile to private. I posted about it because I knew the very first thing my family would do once they got home was try to twist the story and make me the villain, and I was right. I had about an hour head start before they could do that, and I also had video evidence to back up what they had done. No, I do not plan to show the video here, so please don't ask. Being proactive worked. I immediately got a good number of family members on my side. My parents, Dan, and my sister-in-law were probably ready to write their own post, but it was too late, so they didn't even bother lying much. They did have a few flying monkeys supporting them, but not many. Most people already knew how spoiled and entitled they were, so what happened made sense to them and was quickly accepted. There was one person in particular who called me. I don't know who it was, but they screamed at me, saying I was a horrible brother and that I needed to make room for a real family man. I hung up immediately and blocked the number. That never happened again. A week passed, and my parents showed up on my front porch with Dan, exactly like they had threatened in their earlier ultimatum. They rang my doorbell non-stop and banged on the door until I finally answered. I only opened it slightly, and they tried to force their way in again, but I had installed a couple of chain locks that stopped them. I even braced my body against the door just in case. My father and brother demanded that I let them in, but I told them I was recording everything and would call the police if they tried again. My mother calmed them down and then, in the most sickeningly sweet voice, asked if I was ready to let my brother move in. I told her and everyone else to leave and never come back. My mother put on crocodile tears and asked why I couldn't do this for Dan, because he's my beloved brother. I laughed and then said bluntly that I don't love him as a brother because he treated me like garbage for years and they encouraged it. I told them they were terrible parents and he was a terrible brother. I warned them to leave or I would call the police immediately. Shockingly, they left fairly easily, aside from my mother's loud crying and the dirty looks from everyone else. In hindsight, getting them to leave that easily should have been a red flag. I thought the whole mess was over, but I should have taken them more seriously, because they had another stupid plan. Later that week, on Friday afternoon, I came home and found a moving truck and my brother's minivan parked in my driveway. It was Dan and his family. They were already moving things in. He greeted me with a smug smile when he saw me. I was furious and told him and everyone else to stop immediately, but my sister-in-law told me flatly that whether I liked it or not, they were moving in. Then, in the fakest way possible, she tilted her head, pursed her lips, and said it was fine because my mom allowed it, and I should always listen to what my mom tells me. I was boiling with rage just hearing those words and looking at her smug face, so I locked myself in my truck and called the police right away. When they realized what I was doing, my sister-in-law started pounding on my window and screaming at me to stop, saying I couldn't do this to them because she and Dan needed the house. She cried, asking why I couldn't just do this for Dan. I yelled back that it was my fucking house, not theirs. She then threatened to scratch the side of my truck if I didn't stop calling the police, all of which the 911 operator heard because my window was slightly open. I told her that if she damaged my truck, I would sue her, and she was smart enough to back off when the police arrived. Dan, my sister-in-law, and their children had locked themselves inside my house. I explained everything to the police and showed them my new driver's license with my current address on it. When we went to the front door, we saw that they had changed the lock. The old lock was lying on the porch with the center drilled out, and the drill they used was sitting right next to it, along with a full set of drill bits. They couldn't have left more obvious evidence if they tried. I pointed out the broken lock and the drill, then gave the officers a full summary of everything that had happened leading up to this. At some point, Dan must have called our parents, because they showed up while I was still talking to the police. My parents immediately started lying, claiming that I had agreed to rent my house to my brother and his family. I told the officers that was an easily verifiable lie. Dan and my sister-in-law eventually came out of the house holding some papers, both of them wearing smug expressions like they had somehow outplayed me. It turned out they had created and printed a fake rental agreement. My signature wasn't on it. There was a signature, but it looked nothing like my handwriting. I honestly don't think any of them had ever seen my signature before, which made the attempt incredibly stupid. I told my parents and Dan that what they had done was fraud, and if the police investigated it, they would find that out very quickly. I also pointed out that going to jail over something like this wouldn't do them any favors and could even cost Dan his job, which is the only thing supporting his family. I said I would get a lawyer and sue for damages if anything of mine was missing, stolen, or broken, and that I would also call Child Protective Services as a precaution. When I said all of that, Dan went pale and looked genuinely terrified. But my mother stepped between us and kept insisting that I should do this for Dan and live in the damn camper so they could finally have a proper family home to themselves. I yelled at her that if she thought it was such a great idea, she could do it herself for Dan and give him her house instead. The police separated my mother from me, and I said I wanted everyone gone immediately or I would press charges. I shouted about how they had drilled out the lock on my front door to break in, how the rental papers were obvious forgeries with a badly faked version of my signature, and how I had video footage of my sister-in-law attacking me. Those are serious crimes, and I told them I could absolutely use all of that against them if I wanted to. If they didn't leave right now, that's exactly what I would do. The only reason I hadn't already done it was for the sake of Dan's children, so this was their chance to walk away. The moment my parents heard that, I think it finally sank in that they couldn't force me to do it for Dan. My mother gave up and said she would put an end to it. She walked over to my sister-in-law and spoke to her quietly for a minute while my father talked to Dan. Then my sister-in-law started crying loudly, ripping the fake rental papers into pieces and throwing them into the air like confetti, only for one of the officers to tell her to pick them up or be fined for littering. At that point, both officers had the exact same expression that said, "We don't get paid enough for this." Dan had to start telling his kids to load their things back into the moving truck. All the children were crying, and the oldest was sobbing, saying he wouldn't have his own bedroom anymore. My sister-in-law and Dan gathered their kids for one last, pathetic attempt to guilt-trip me with the sad family routine, you know, the one, where everyone huddles together in a group hug, all staring in the same direction. I swear it felt rehearsed. Every child had the same pleading look, trembling lips and all. My sister-in-law kept rubbing her pregnant belly and tilting her head to look like a sad puppy, while my brother put on the most miserable expression he could and said, "Please don't do this, we need to live here." I didn't hesitate for a second. I told them to keep packing. The kids and my sister-in-law turned the crying up to maximum, and Dan shouted at me, asking if I was satisfied with myself, accusing me of denying them a home because I was too selfish to share and help family. I started laughing like a maniac and told him that what he was trying to do was taking, not sharing, and that no amount of crying would make me let his family move in. He wasn't my brother anymore, just a spoiled, entitled idiot who thought he could take whatever he wanted from me, just like when we were kids. Dan started hurling insults at me until the police told him to calm down or they would put him in handcuffs, regardless of whether I wanted to press charges. He bit his lip and looked like a mix of pure rage and fear. I asked the officers to stay until my parents, brother, and sister-in-law were gone, and they said they had no intention of leaving until the situation was fully resolved. In fact, within minutes, 2 officers turned into 4 when additional units arrived for some reason. That gave my parents even more incentive to leave. I made Dan hand over the keys to the new lock he had installed on my front door, although I replaced the lock the very next day anyway because I didn't know if copies existed. He resisted handing them over, and instead of giving them to me, he threw them down the street into a storm drain and told me to go get them myself. One of the officers scolded him and made him retrieve them. He had to remove the grate to reach them and got pretty filthy in the process. When he finally got the keys back, he snorted and tossed them into my hand. I told all of them to leave and never come back. My mother said I would be disowned for this, like it was supposed to be a threat. I looked at them and, in an overly sarcastic tone, said something along the lines of, "Oh no, that means I won't get to attend any more family holidays where I'm treated like garbage anyway because Dan has always been the favorite." They treated me so badly growing up that if Dan ever needed an organ donor, I wouldn't give him anything. So they could do what they always told me to do when I was being abused by all of them, deal with it. My parents were stunned after I said that, and the 4 officers were watching them with extremely judgmental expressions. Honestly, if you ever want to put awful parents like mine in a difficult position, confront them in front of the police, because they're far less likely to do something truly stupid. My mother just started crying and walking away. My father stood there staring at me like he wanted to hit me. Dan stood there holding his kids, completely defeated. And my sister-in-law was throwing a full-blown tantrum on my front lawn. It took a while, but eventually everyone lined up, handed out boxes, and carried their belongings out of my house. Nothing had been unpacked yet, so it all came out fairly quickly. While this was happening, my mother kept saying it wasn't too late and that I could still do this for Dan, over and over again, each time trying to negotiate more desperately to change my mind. She said Dan could pay rent if I let them stay. When that didn't work, she suggested I move back in with them so Dan could rent my house and wouldn't have to share the building. I told her to shut up and keep packing boxes. I don't want Dan or his family anywhere near me. I don't want their money, and I certainly don't want to live with him or with my parents ever again. After how they treated me as a child, making a deal with my parents would feel like making a deal with the devil. My sister-in-law had another meltdown after hearing that. She threw a box onto the ground, then sat on the floor and threw herself a full pity party because she didn't want to go back to sharing a house with my parents. She stayed there looking angry and miserable until everyone else finished. She didn't even want to stand up when it was time to leave. Eventually, everything was removed from the house and loaded into the truck. Before they left, I unloaded one last time on my parents about everything they put me through while I was growing up. With 4 police officers standing right there, they couldn't do much more than stand there and take it. I confronted them about so many things, including how they couldn't do one decent thing for me, like letting me stay with my camper when I was homeless and trying to get back on my feet. I reminded them how they let Dan and my sister-in-law ridicule me and call me a lazy bum. Well, who's the bum now? They wanted to throw me out of my own house so Dan could live there for free, yet when I needed somewhere to go, they wanted to charge me more than I could afford just to park my camper, even though they knew I was unemployed. The looks the police gave them when I said all of that were extremely judgmental. So I put my parents on the spot one last time and asked them what I had ever done, other than being born, to deserve being treated so badly. I asked why, the moment I finally had a bit of success in my life, they wanted to take it away and give it to their favorite child. They clearly preferred that I give everything to Dan and be left with nothing myself. I bought my house with the money I earned. I don't owe them anything, and I will never ask them for anything again, because to them I will never be more than a doormat or a cash cow. They didn't answer me. They just stood there, staring like fish out of water. So I kept ranting and asked them, for the love of God, what made them think they were good parents after everything they had done. My father was red as a tomato, but this time it looked more like shame than anger. My mother was crying and saying I was a horrible person. I fully agreed and told her she was a horrible person too. All of them were. I even said I bet they'd end up in hell for it. They were terrible people and everyone knew it. If I had thrown all of this in their faces privately instead of in public, they would have just gotten angry and continued pretending I was the problem. They'd lived in denial for so long that it had become part of who they were. My mother buried her face in my father's jacket and cried, and my father looked more defeated than I had ever seen him. Dan and his family avoided me completely while they finished loading everything back into the moving truck. I made sure none of my things were stolen, not that I had much furniture to begin with. At that point, I was lucky to even own a couch. Everyone got back into their vehicles, and my sister-in-law just stared at me with pure malice until my brother finally convinced her to drive the minivan home. As soon as they were gone, I went back online and told the full truth about what had happened. This time, my parents were too ashamed to even try to defend themselves. The family had already been somewhat divided before this incident, but after that, it became an avalanche in my favor. Almost the entire family sided with me. Those who didn't simply stayed neutral. No matter how much my parents tried to repeat the line, "We did it for Dan," no one listened. Whatever family support they had left was gone. Many relatives I never expected to support me did, including former flying monkeys. At that point, I offered to host about half the family at my new house for Christmas Eve. Surprisingly, I wasn't blocked on my brother's or sister-in-law's profiles, and I saw that my sister-in-law gave birth to their fourth child in early November. They still live with my parents. I'm pretty sure they knew I was watching because my sister-in-law kept making passive-aggressive posts every couple of weeks about not having enough space while living with my parents, probably hoping she could still guilt-trip me. I'm also sure she's driving my parents insane, because they now have no peace or quiet in their old age, with 3 loud, annoying kids, 1 mentally unstable daughter-in-law, their golden child son, and a newborn all under the same roof. Maybe they could move into a camper in their own backyard and let Dan fully take over their house. They could finally have some peace that way. Yes, they could do that for Dan. There was supposed to be more, but this post got too long, so I plan to post a part 3 later. Update 2. I originally tried to keep this to 2 posts, but while putting everything together, I realized the second part was still too long, so I split it again. Part 3 is coming. For everyone who flooded the comments telling me to install cameras, I will when I can afford it. I'm still recovering financially after buying a house last year, and as far as I know, good cameras also need a decent computer to record properly. All I have is a 3-year-old laptop running Windows 10. Yes, I know about doorbell cameras. That will be the first one I buy. For those saying I should have sent my brother and sister-in-law to jail, the only reason I didn't is because they are parents and their children need them. If Dan were arrested, he'd probably lose his job, and without that, his family would have no income. My sister-in-law also had a 1-month-old baby at the time. None of them needed to end up in jail. That said, you don't need jail for revenge. The police can help, yes, but I got my revenge without filing a police report. Will I be that compassionate again? Very unlikely, and they know it. I decided to wait until after the new year to post again in case more happened, and it did. As earlier readers know, my sister-in-law kept making passive-aggressive posts on social media that were clearly aimed at me, especially after she had her 4th child in November. She kept posting the same repetitive nonsense over and over, just reworded slightly each time. It was always about being tired of living with my parents, not having enough space, needing her own house, blah blah blah. I know I sound dismissive, but live through what I've been through with these people and you'd be ready to sarcastically play tiny violins for them too. They're just that bad. Since I waited until January to post an update, more things happened, exactly like I expected. I mentioned before that I invited half the family to a Christmas Eve gathering at my house, and everyone I invited came, even though it was a 3 to 4 hour drive for them. They wanted to show their support. They praised me for working so hard to buy a house on my own and said they were sorry for everything I'd gone through. Some asked why I didn't just take my camper and drive the 3 hours back to them instead of living almost homeless for so long. I had to admit, a bit shyly, that I was very attached to living here and that the best job opportunities in my field were in this area. My hometown doesn't really have opportunities like that, if any at all, and I wanted to build my career as much as possible. They generally accepted that answer. We ended up having a really nice party, the best one I'd had in years. Some relatives even brought CDs of classic Christmas albums, and I have to say the Ray Charles one my uncle brought was my favorite. He sings Christmas songs like no one else I've ever heard. It was a genuinely happy moment, and for once I felt like I could forget my past problems and just enjoy the present. But I wouldn't be writing this if it had stayed that way. About 2 hours into the party, you can probably guess who showed up. My parents, my brother, and my sister-in-law walked in, all smiles. They didn't even knock. They just came through the front door like they had a right to be there. I turned off the music and told them to leave immediately. They begged to stay and said they brought gifts. One of my uncles stood up and shouted at them before I even had another chance to speak. He said they didn't deserve to be in my home or in my life after what they tried to do months earlier. Several other relatives backed him up. For context, this uncle is my mother's brother and used to adore her until he learned what happened between my parents and me. My grandparents, my mother's parents, as elderly as they are, hurriedly stepped between us and told my parents that if they wanted to reconcile with me, it was far too soon. They said they had never been more disappointed in them than they were over the past year. They had hidden their favoritism toward my brother from prying eyes for a long time, but no one was fooled anymore. They told my parents they would need to make a serious effort to treat me like a son if they ever wanted to be part of my life again. Then they turned to Dan and my sister-in-law and said they'd seen the repetitive nonsense my sister-in-law kept posting online. They were sick of it and told them to let it go already. My house was not going to become their new home. My sister-in-law reverted to her usual crying routine and threw herself a pity party, saying she should be the one living here instead of me. She dropped into a chair and had a full tantrum, saying it wasn't fair that I had this house all to myself when I didn't even have a family, while she had 4 kids who needed more space. She said she just wanted a better place to live and to feel like a real mother. This part was petty on my end, but I said out loud that she was a bad mother because she lets my mom do most of the parenting while she sits around all day drinking, playing on her phone, or going out and spending all of Dan's money. She even has the nerve to complain about it. I joked that I was surprised her baby wasn't drunk off breast milk, given how much alcohol she drinks. I'll admit that was probably too far, because I got a few looks. My sister-in-law demanded to know if I was calling her a bad mother. I said the evidence speaks for itself, and if she ever wants to move out of my parents' house someday, she needs to put her college degree to use, get a job, and learn how to save money. My mother already does most of the childcare for my brother's kids anyway. So she would have plenty of time once her baby got a little older. My brother's oldest child, who is 7, suddenly ran over and started kicking me while yelling at me for yelling at his mom. He kept shouting that his mom said I was the bad guy, that I made her cry, and that I wouldn't let them live here. That was when my brother grabbed his son to pull him away, but at that point the rest of the relatives stepped in again. What followed turned into something like a full family intervention against my brother and my sister-in-law. She was crying, her newborn was crying, their other kids were crying, and hell, even Dan looked like he was on the verge of tears from the verbal beating everyone was giving him. He ended up sitting on the bench by the front door where I keep my shoes, looking like a complete wreck. He couldn't make eye contact with anyone and couldn't even get a couple of words out, not with the whole house full of angry people ready to judge him. If everyone hadn't been there to stop it, I'm sure this would have ended up being a repeat of when he tried to order me around and take my house months earlier. At this point, though, he'd been so thoroughly humiliated that his reputation, and my parents as well, were completely destroyed within the family. All the masks were finally off. Not long after my parents, my brother, and my sister-in-law left in defeat, the party resumed, and we all avoided talking about what had just happened for the rest of the night. Since most of the adults had been drinking, everyone stayed over at my place. I even let some people sleep in the camper so there would be enough room. Honestly, it works pretty well as a guest house. My relatives wanted to see it and said they couldn't believe I'd lived in it for nearly 2 years. I got a lot of questions about what it was like, especially during summer and winter. I woke up before everyone else on Christmas morning and had a fresh pot of coffee ready, along with some ibuprofen for the eggnog hangovers a few of them had. They praised me for being a much better host than my parents ever were, and we all agreed to do this again next Christmas. After Christmas, my sister-in-law finally stopped making posts that were clearly indirect shots at me and deleted all the old ones too. But shortly after the new year, she made another post complaining about how she had tried to convince my parents to get a camper like mine so they could set it up in the backyard and let Dan and his family use the whole house as their family home. Turns out the taste of her own medicine wasn't very enjoyable. My parents flatly refused that idea. Apparently no one was going to force them out of their own house, let alone out of their master bedroom. That post stayed up for only a couple of days before my sister-in-law deleted it, and she's barely posted anything since. She loves to complain, but if a tree falls and no one is around to hear it, I guess she realized there's no point when no one is listening. Dan still can't afford to move his family on just his salary in the short term, and if they end up having another kid in the next few years, I honestly wouldn't be surprised. Things have been calm for me since then. I've even invited friends over for poker nights. I'm terrible at poker because I can't remember anything, but who cares? We drank beer, ate junk food, grabbed Burger King waffles, and just had a great time doing what guys do when they want to relax and get a little drunk. I think maybe this summer I'll consider dating again. It's not like I'm getting any younger. Fingers crossed it goes well. My camper now just sits unused in my yard, and I'll admit there were days when I went out there just to spend some time in it. I lived in it for 2 years, so it feels like a second home. Maybe one day I'll actually use it for camping like it was meant for. I've never been camping before. My parents always said it was a waste of time, so it would be a completely new experience for me. That's more or less the end of what happened. My parents, my brother, and my sister-in-law have been avoiding me entirely. In fact, they seem to have gone back to acting like I don't exist, just like they did before I bought my house. I don't mind at all. It's better this way. But I know they'll inevitably come back in some form. I just wonder what kind of nonsense they'll try next. If anything notable happens again like all of this, I'll make another post, assuming this account is still active. Update 3. This probably won't surprise some people who commented on my earlier posts, because my parents ended up doing a few of the exact things people predicted they would. They wanted my money or my signature. I was expecting the classic narcissist lines about how I owed them or some socialist nonsense about sharing wealth, but that was just my imagination running wild. What actually happened was somewhat similar, but much calmer. I guess you could say they knew better than to push me too hard and mostly aimed for pity. It started when my parents recently reached out to me through social media and asked to meet in a public place of my choosing. It sounded like a trap, but I wasn't scared. Honestly, I found it amusing. They know they can't push me around anymore, so I was curious what they wanted this time. I picked a local restaurant and met them there. Dan was with them but stayed mostly quiet. We exchanged awkward greetings, ordered some drinks, and got straight to the point. My parents begged me to help Dan get his own apartment so he could finally move out. Apparently, Dan's credit isn't very good. I wonder why. Could it be because his wife regularly spends him into the ground? They asked me to help either by providing some upfront money or by co-signing for the apartment and helping pay the rent. I immediately said no to both. That's when Dan snapped and yelled at me, saying I have plenty of money and no family to support like he does, that he needed my help, and that I should be saving money for his family since I don't have one of my own. I laughed and asked where they were when I needed help. Oh right, they were laughing at me for being homeless. Or should we go even further back into my childhood? I'd be happy to go into detail, especially with an audience. My mother grabbed my hand and begged me not to talk about any of that. My father and Dan just looked away and said nothing. I'm pretty sure they wanted to snap at me like they used to, but they held back. I asked them if they thought I was rich or something, and their expression said everything. When I told them I didn't have that kind of money, they stared at me like deer caught in headlights. I explained how much I had managed to save for my down payment, how I had to live and work to save that much so quickly, and how I spent almost all of it on the house. I told them I was still recovering financially. Yes, I have monthly income, but most of it goes straight into savings. I asked Dan what his annual salary was, and when he told me, I pointed out that it was actually a bit higher than mine. I then broke things down in rough math in front of my parents, explaining that around 70% of my income goes to my mortgage, insurance, gas, internet, phone, food, and other bills. That leaves maybe 30% at best for savings. I need that money to get ahead and to make sure I have a safety net. My truck is from the 1990s. If it breaks down, I need money to fix or replace it. There are also emergency expenses like home repairs, medical bills, taxes, legal fees, or anything else where you suddenly need cash. So as you can see, I simply can't afford to give Dan money, and I refuse to co-sign for anything because that would put me on the hook for any bill Dan couldn't or wouldn't pay. I pointed out that this was probably why my parents never co-signed for Dan's apartment years ago. At that point, my mother started crying again. I was already a step ahead of them the entire time. I told them straight to their faces that I'm not an ATM and I'm not an idiot. I expected my father to get angry like he always used to, but this time he didn't. I've known this man to explode over the smallest refusal to help my brother my entire life, but this time he just didn't. There wasn't even a scowl on his face. The only way I can describe his expression was regret and defeat. Maybe regret for being a terrible father, or maybe regret that he can't intimidate me anymore. Who knows? Either way, my parents couldn't argue with me, and I wasn't giving Dan any money. Dan stood up and said this whole thing was a waste of time and that he was leaving. My mother apologized for him, but Dan still walked out. Just to be polite, I offered to buy them an unlimited soup and salad round while we were there. I guess they couldn't say no to free food, since we'd only ordered drinks up to that point, so they stayed. I made an effort to talk about anything that wasn't money. Dan stayed silent, either eating or staring at his phone, while my parents awkwardly made small talk. They mentioned they'd recently joined a local Christian church and had been attending for the past 2 weeks. I told them good for them. Of course, they tried to gently suggest that I should go too. I said no thanks, and they were smart enough not to push it. When the meal ended, Dan left a $10 bill on the table as a tip and walked out without saying another word to me or anyone else. My mother excused his behavior, and we all went our separate ways. That was pretty much it. There wasn't nearly as much drama as I expected, but this is still far better than how things used to be with my parents and my brother. As for my sister-in-law, she's continued complaining online about my parents. She clearly doesn't like that she's no longer the queen of the house, and I think her toxicity is finally wearing them down. Why else would they be so desperate to crawl back to me? She really wants my parents to move into a camper like I did to make space in the house, and they keep telling her no. She does seem to have a small group of like-minded supporters, though, because every now and then I get messages from strangers determined to attack me for not handing my house over to my sister-in-law. I don't bother arguing with them anymore. I just block them and move on. There was one persistent troll who somehow had my phone number and kept calling from different numbers. It sounded like the same person who once called me to say I needed to make room for a real family man like Dan. I couldn't care less. The calls have slowed down, if not stopped completely, after I made it clear I was just being entertained by them. The last call was earlier this month, and it's been quiet ever since.